Let's talk about the Christianization of the Germanic peoples, including the northern Germanic tribes, but that was at the end of the story. The bulk of the Christianization happened in continental Europe. And, most pagans these days don't talk about this. They avoid the subject as much as possible because they don't know anything about it. They watch the show Vikings or now Valhalla, and they say, oh, those Christians killed or converted. They forced us to Christianity. Not for the most part, they didn't. For the most part, it was kings saying, hey, we're all going to be Christian now, or wives of kings saying, hey, we're all going to be Christian now, and then the kings being like, all right, I guess. That's mostly how it happened. There are a few instances of kill or convert, and we will go over those. But let's start at the beginning. Now, we got to realize there's two types of Christianity. There's Trinitarian and Arianism. Now, I know the term Arian gets a lot of flack nowadays, but it didn't always mean what it meant now. So Arianism was this idea that God was a separate entity. He was like a monarch of religion. And Jesus was just like a side character. It was his son, but he wasn't God or divine. He was just the Son of God, a representation on earth. Now, the Trinitarians or the Nicaeans was the belief like the Romans, right? And in the Council of Nicaea, they decided that Jesus was the Son of God and therefore divine and part of the Holy Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are all God. So there's two very different and conflicting ideas coming in from the East. Now, in the Edict of Milan, which happened in 313, Constantine, from his mom, I think, was saying, all right, we're all going to be Christian now. And took about 10 years for it to happen, but it did happen. And by extension of that, the Eastern Germanic tribes were hit first because some of their territories were actually in Roman territory. And we see from archaeological evidence that there was already a certain amount of syncretism happening, where we'd see, influences from the northern Germanic tribes, via like Odinic kind of influences in their deities. But we'd also see influences from Eastern Germanic or Eastern European and pre-Christian Roman stuff, all being melded into certain deities. So it only makes sense that as they Christianize, so would the next link in the chain, and that would be the Eastern Germanic peoples. Now, you may never heard of the Vandals or the Alemannics, but you've certainly heard of the Goths. Now, these were the Ostrogoths, or the Eastern Goths. And then we had the Visigoths, who were the Western Goths. In Old Norse, it'd be Vester, Western, and Auster, Eastern, if you've ever studied languages. So the Eastern Goths were converted first, but the Romans didn't stop there, man. They just kept going right across the bottom of Europe, converted the Franks in the same time frame-ish. The Eastern Germanic peoples were first in the 300s and the 400s. But by 600, the Franks were Christianized, even though there was some fighting there back and forth. And then same with the Spaniards, who were the Visigoths. So a lot of people got converted in the next, 300-400 years. And that brings us to about 600, but not quite. Because after they all converted, in the late 500s, there was Pope Gregory. And the mission of Pope Gregory was to spread Christianity, which he did. Now, he was in contact with Bertha. Now, Bertha was the king's consort of Kent, England. Now, the English, or the Anglo-Saxons, were a group of Germanic tribes. These are the Western Germanic tribes. And they were comprised of the Utes, the Angles, the Saxons, and of course the Frisians, right? And they all had their eastern territories in England, and they were known as the Angles. So these guys were converted. Essentially, it all started with Bertha, the king of Kent's consort, Ethelbert. Well, Ethelbert, he was converted in about 600. And what happened was Bertha was in contact with Pope Gregory. And she's like, hey, I want to convert my husband. And he's like, cool, I'll send a dude. He sent Augustine. I believe it was Bishop Augustine up there. And I've read quite a bit about this. He started teaching at what was her original church. I don't remember the name, but it became the Abbey of St. Peter and Paul. And this is at Canterbury. Well, Augustine successfully converted Ethelbert in around the beginning of 600, and then he died just a few short years later, and that place, the Abbey of St. Peter and Paul was renamed the Abbey of St. Augustine because he became a saint. And from there, Christianity spread throughout all of England. And the last one was Arwald, the last one to convert. He wasn't converted; he was killed. This is one of those instances. So he died in battle as the last pagan king of England in the Isle of Wight. That was his territory. And he was like, I'm not converting. Not happening. And the Christians killed him and converted him. And then they killed his sons. And they were known as Saint Arwald. His sons were baptized right before they were executed. So Christianity definitely took a very serious turn in England. Now, they kind of continued this push, because then Christianity really ramped up in Franconia, in the area of the Franks, France, and all the way till Charlemagne, right? Now, Charlemagne was a big bad dude, and him and his son, Louis the Pious, really pushed this conversion stuff, and they pushed it right up into Saxony, which is the central Germanic tribes, where all Germanians essentially come from. And they, fought their way up there and converted everybody by force, right? And then there was some riots back and forth, but this happened, in the 700s, the late 700s. And at the same time, they were pushing up on the Frisians. Basically, here's Germany, here's France, here's Frisia, right? And then here's Scandinavia, obviously. So by the 800s, they had converted the Saxons. But it was kind of back and forth, and then, what's his name? Not Pope. Louis the Pious died in like 830 something. And then that kind of quashed that era for a while. But they kept pushing up on the Frisians, getting more of the Central Germanic peoples. So at this point, we'd had the Eastern Germanic peoples, the Western Germanic peoples all converted. Now they were pushing up on the Northern Germanic peoples, which were the Frisians. And by the early 900s, the late 800s, early 900s, they did start converting them. But it's funny, everybody fought it. The pagans, the heathens, they fought back, and it happened a couple times with the Frisians. They kicked out the Christians and became pagan again. So now it's pushing up against 900, and this is where Scandinavia starts getting it. So who was it first? It's mostly attributed to King Olaf II, but he didn't really have it. It was Harald Bluetooth Christianized everybody. Canute the Great was a big force in the 1030s. I think he died as well. That's really when Scandinavia got Christianized, and it wasn't by force. It was because everybody else was already a Christian. Right? Everybody south of them was Christianized, and everybody west of them was Christianized. And it ended up, what was it? Olaf went to England. He got Christianized. He brought it back to Norway. And he was like, okay. And the Swedes were some of the last to hold out. Some of the southern Swedish places were converted in the early 1000s. But it wasn't really till the 1100s and almost until the 1200s. To where, Scandinavia was actually Christianized. They held out for hundreds of years. Because a lot of the folk people, the heathens or the heath dwellers, they kept to the old traditions. But eventually they all were just bred out, because when they first came down that, hey, we're going to be Christian now, there was plenty of people saying, no, we're not. You guys can do whatever you want, but we're going to stick with the old gods. That's how we run things. And they did for hundreds of years afterwards. And there's no historical backing to say that paganism died out completely. When you'll hear the odd person, I've been practicing this way, our family's been practicing this way since, the Viking Age. That's quite a possibility. I'm not saying it's ever true when people claim it, because people make all sorts of wild claims today. But, like in Iceland, we know that they were doing pagan practices till the 1200s, because there was laws on the book saying they could. And at that point, nobody really cared, because they were so few and far between, but they did exist. So, the Christianization of the Germanic peoples happened over about 1,000-year period. And, you know, it was slow going for the most part. And for the most part, like I said, it was kings saying, oh, my wife said we're going to be Christian now, so we're going to be Christian. And that's kind of how it happened. So, if you want to read anything about this, there's actually a pretty decent page on Wikipedia. It has tons of sources at the bottom, but that's a good jumping off point. If you want to know about specifics, you know, Sven Forkbeard and his kids, and Hauerfaga, and, you know, Sigurdsson, and their, you know, their trials and tribulations towards the end of the Viking Age, and how everybody finally was converted, that's a good jumping off point. But yeah, man, it was a long process, and, you know, it didn't happen just by the sword. So we need to get that out of our heads. Anyways, I hope everybody enjoyed. I hope everybody found it informative, and hope everybody has a great day.